Well, since you guys enjoyed the last Skrillex tips and tricks video and were asking for a part 2, I dove back into the Skrillex Instagram IDs to see what I could learn from them. And I really enjoyed this particular drop here. It just seems so gritty, brutal, and simplistic. All the elements I like in a drop. And here's my recreation of it, minus the vocals. And yeah, when attempting to recreate that, 3 things stood out to me. And by far the easiest thing, the first thing that stood out to me was the simplicity of the drums. This is literally all the drums are. Just that on repeat. You know, as producers, we tend to overcomplicate things, make things way more harder than it needs to be. But if your bass is moving, which this particular bass is moving constantly, just throughout pitch, then you can get away with super simplistic drums, and then it comes down to sample selection and making sure your samples are absolutely fantastic. If they sound really good off the bat, they're just going to carry the tune. And the second thing that really stood out to me was the movement of the bass. Isolate that for you. First of all, just having a really kind of, well, not groovy, but just interesting bass kind of repetition. So in my recreation, I did it with Operator. First of all, getting that tone was such a pain in the butt, as you can see by the overdrives, EQ, and saturator. I mean, you can take a super simple, that doesn't sound too flash. It could be improved with pitch envelope. Just adds another dimension. Bit more movement. Intensity. It's so sick. It's yet again the subtle things that really make it shine. And as well as creating those kind of descending little pitch variances at the start, there's a particularly long note here, which you can see that repeats there. Couldn't tell if I was imagining this or I actually heard it in the track, but it sounded like with these long notes, the pitch envelope was slightly longer for it. So I used a bit of automation on the decay. Maybe it's not on the track, maybe I am imagining things, but just to add another subtle variant. Also, one other thing I will mention is I did a drop off pitch envelope towards the end. You can find that at the end of these long notes. Subtle variety in the pitch of the bass. On point. And lastly, the third thing with recreating this drop was the percussive element. Straight off the bat, nothing too crazy, but having a closer look at the waveform, it looks like the percussion starts early, and that got me thinking, offset the percussion slightly. This is a classic kind of EDM trick. You do it with claps in particular on like electro house. But seeing it on a perc layer was super interesting. Don't get me wrong, Skrillex is definitely not the first one to offset percussive sounds, or any sounds of that matter, but just seeing this in the waveform being like, huh, so that's how he does it. This is where the start of the sound should actually start. But I'll offset the percussion slightly to the left and introduce a fade like so. So we've got this initial kind of fade in sound right before the note should actually start. And it sounds super interesting compared to a staccato kind of on the grid sound. But when you play it in the track, it sounds even better. So I'll play normal first. Sounds very staccato. I'm going to switch to our slightly offset one now. Kind of actually makes it sound slightly out of time, which is a really cool effect. Having those slightly offset sounds in the same group as the sub, and then glue compressed together with a really slow attack, blends them together really nicely. And those are 3 things I learned trying to recreate a Skrillex drops. Just drop the music already, Skrillex. Next album, please.